Hello and welcome everyone to our very last MTI Live of 2024. I'm super excited to be joined today by three amazing panelists. So we've got Jason McEwen from Neurovalens, Vibhaswan Ghoshal from OBio, and Sandra Elliott from Hackensack Meridian Health. Looking forward to talking to them today all about clinical studies and clinical trials. So how do you go about deciding that you're ready for a clinical trial? How do you go about choosing the right site for this? So really great to have folks with expertise in, the US and Canadian hospital systems here to talk about differences between that. And also understanding, is this even required? Maybe you're going down a PMA and you need to do a clinical study, or maybe you're doing a 510K and you want some, confirmatory data to help your application or for marketing purposes down the road. So understanding, really when is the right time, and then how do you go about working with these healthcare systems? So negotiating contracts, what are they looking for in this? So really excited to hear from our panelists about all these topics and then more. We'll even get down to, how do you fund these? Can often be one of the most expensive parts of the process for med device startup is clinical studies. So looking at some, creative ways that we might think about this. So without further ado, I want you guys to hear from our panelists themselves. So we'll start off with Sandra from Hackensack Meridian Health. I'd love to hear about your background, Sandra.
Thanks for having me. Sandra Elliott. I'm the Chief Innovation and Commercialization Officer for Hackensack Meridian Health, which is the largest health delivery system in the state of New Jersey. We serve about 4 million patients. I think for us on the innovation side, and particularly on the medtech side, we work with a lot of early stage companies to do two things. One is to kind of help us meet our own clinical needs, but also identify opportunities to really bring that technology into the organization and do joint partnerships, potentially even do clinical trials, those kinds of things. So we're very aggressive at very specifically targeting solutions that are targeting the clinical needs that we have. So I'm looking forward to learning a little bit more about some of the companies that are here today, and happy to answer any questions as we go through the process.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I'm really looking forward to hearing your expertise on this subject. Vibhaswan, what about you? What's your background?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Nicole, on this really great panel. I'm Vibhaswan Ghoshal. I'm the Senior Director of Technology Adoption at OBio. We are a not-for-profit, membership-based life sciences accelerator, life sciences and medtech accelerator, helping companies in their early stages to help them raise capital investments. From seed to Series A, and also helping companies to get their products into the market. We have also built a network of around 74 healthcare organizations and ever-growing network of healthcare organizations in Canada, representing large health systems to smaller, primary care clinics to help support the adoption of innovative solutions from Canadian companies into these healthcare systems. So my background is in digital health and informatics and helping companies commercialize their products. I've been successfully involved in helping companies getting their products into the market from their early commercialization to adoption in healthcare delivery, and would love to share my experience working with the largest healthcare network in Canada and working with multiple health systems with differing needs.
Thanks, Vibhaswan. And working with Canada should be top of mind for everyone in our cohort that's heading out to Canada next week for the MedTech conference powered by AdvaMed. So we're going to have 63 of our companies there, both early and mid-stage, presenting in panels across 3 days. And also we're going to have some competitions up there. So if you guys are listening on LinkedIn and you happen to be going to this conference, definitely make sure to check those out. Got an amazing cohort, and really love to chat with you guys there as well. So thanks, Vibhaswan. Looking forward to seeing you in person there. And then last but certainly not least, we've got Jason from Neurovalens. They're working on some very cool products, and we're actually in our MedTech Innovator cohort back in 2022. So already doing so many incredible things just 2 years out, and really looking forward to hearing Jason's perspective on this.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Just a real quick then, I can say, so Jason McEwen, CEO of Neurovalens, we make non-invasive neurostimulators. They're worn on the head for 30 minutes a day, and they stimulate deep parts of the brain. And then probably what I'll talk about or answer questions on later is at one point we had 5 pivotal clinical trials running in parallel. 4 of those trials have now finished, and we're working through our approvals. We've got our first 2 clearances earlier this year, and now we're looking at, I suppose, commercialization of those devices and then the subsequent approvals as they come through.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I first met Jason in Boston at the Device Talks conference, and he was telling me all about the different clinical trials they're running all at once for different indications, and I was just so amazed by that. So I think he's going to have some good things to share with you all on how to choose these sites and indications as well. So we'll hop right into this. And for those of you guys joining on LinkedIn, if you have any questions that come up that you want to ask the panelists, please put them in the comments of the event. Our wonderful marketing and events assistant, Gabby, will get those questions to me so that I can ask those during our live portion. The last 30 minutes is going to be private cohort Q&A. So for those of you joining from the cohort, if you guys are thinking of questions you're going along, feel free to put those in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to those in the last half hour. But feel free to enter them whenever. Maybe someone mentioned something and you I just want to put this down before I forget it. Feel free to put those in whenever. So awesome. We're going to start launching things off by talking about, how do you initiate a clinical study and when is really the right time for this? So, a lot of our startups are very early stage, maybe still, finalizing the design of their product and wondering, really when is the right time to start thinking about this and planning clinical trial. So Sandra, maybe we can hear from you first, and then Bibaswan, what are your perspectives on the companies you guys work with, and when is the time that they start to plan?
I would say that for us, a lot of our clinicians and researchers like to be involved very early on. So you may be in the throes of the development of that solution, but make sure before you're ready to go to clinical trial that you're also taking into consideration things that maybe you're not aware of on the clinical interaction. So the earlier, the better. And it's so much easier to kind of direct your clinical trial with those partnerships, if you will, very early on.
Great advice. Yeah. Love thinking about that, and maybe can even help guide your product design as you're planning this and realizing, some aspects of your trial that you want to test.
Absolutely.
Bibaswan, what are your thoughts on this? When is the right time?
Yeah, I think I agree with Sandra. First of all, companies need to understand that product design is also it's very important to take feedback on product design as well, right? So first of all, try to identify who are your end users, who are your customers, right? Who are your paying customers? Once you've identified these 2 groups, you need feedback from both, whether it's to start thinking about a large-scale clinical trial, because clinical trials can be a small pilot to a multi-site, large-scale clinical trial trying to gather clinical data, right? And based on either, I think you need to start early, get those clinicians, because these are the clinicians then who will champion these clinical trials as well later on, right? So establishing those relationships, keeping the clinical trial in mind, I think it starts as early as trying to develop that MVP, right? That you're trying to take to clinical trial and then gather the data on the clinical safety and efficacy of the product. So as early as possible. Now there's 2 kind of scenarios that I have seen. The first are spin-outs from universities or hospital academic institutes. Now, once they are spinning out, obviously they have the backing of the university or that academic institute, because it's their IP and they're sort of licensing their IP to the innovators. In that case, they already have an established site where they probably get their first clinical data out. However, it's important to go outside of that host institution, what we call in Canada, just to go out and see who else is there and who else is interested in your product, right? And try to make those connections early enough so that once you are ready for like a multi-site clinical trial, you have those pieces already established.
Yeah, that's really good feedback, Bibaswan. I like building those relationships sooner and coming back to them to see what down the line you might want to work in based on their feedback as well. So really glad you mentioned that. And so when we're considering whether or not we need to even start planning one, a lot of our companies going down the PMA pathway or the de novo pathway. No, for sure this is going to be on their short-term timeline or roadmap to market. But I would say probably about half of our companies are actually going down the 510(k) pathway where they have a predicate device and, don't always need clinical study data. So Jason, would love to hear from you. Are there any scenarios where clinical data is required for clearance down this pathway?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose just as the guys were saying, I don't think you can start too early in the whole process thinking about the clinical trials. But a key consideration is, are these pivotal clinical trials that actually allow approval, or are they more academic clinical trials that allow you to make, marketing or labeling claims? And the experience that we've had across all our devices, we actually have devices in almost every category. So 510Ks, de novos, and actually one PMA. So we design all of our trials around that. But specific to the 510K, in 2019, the FDA actually updated their guidance for our type of device. They basically said, we only accept the technical spec of the device in the predicate or in the 510K. We no longer accept old clinical data. So it basically means you can identify a predicate. It allows you to do a 510K. So it's it's not a simple process, but it's more simple than the other ones. But you then have to back that up with pivotal clinical trials. And at that time, before the changes in the regulations, we actually were planning to do 2 de novos. So essentially, a 510K with a clinical trial is actually quite comparable to just a de novo. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, because if the FDA say it's a 510K, that's what it is. But we would have preferred to actually have a de novo so we could separate ourselves from these older predicates that they no longer accept the clinical data.
That's a really good point. We actually had our regulatory webinar last week, and I asked this question, like of if you had the option, which would you go down? And in one of our panelists, Christy, was like, "Well, the FDA will tell you, and you have to follow it."
Yeah.
So, I definitely
Exactly.
good to know this is, I mean, basically just as much work, but like without possibly some of those claims and expanded indications that you could think about with the de novo. So that's where maybe this clinical data could come in for marketing purposes and things like that. Sandra, would love to hear from you for this. Even if a clinical study isn't required for clearance, are there scenarios where running one would be useful? Like, do you guys see a lot of studies for marketing and adoption purposes?
I would say we're starting to see more on the marketing and adoption purposes. We've seen a lot on the 510K side of things, more so than anything, but we're starting to see much more on the actual application and the ability of people to say, look what we've done in one location as compared to another. And it really just makes it kind of going back to the clinical use case, right? So you can demonstrate, and also you're demonstrate the outcome, but you can also create those references, if you will, of people that are really going to make sure to help kind of be that advocate for why it makes good sense to use this device or this technology.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Bibaswan, I'd love to hear from you on this too, and especially how it is in Canada. Like, do the bodies in Canada usually accept clinical trials from the US? Do they often have to do additional in Canada? What are most of the trials you've seen? What
Yeah.
have been their purpose?
Yeah, sure. Great question, Nicole. I think in terms of highlighting the differences between Canada and the US, I think obviously here we have Health Canada, who's the regulatory body similar to the FDA. Now, a lot of there are obviously, Health Canada obviously follows FDA as one of the, regulatory bodies, and they have sort of cross connection and themes that you can see that they're common between the two organizations. One thing I would definitely highlight is if you have got an FDA designation already, that helps in your Health Canada approvals. They do accept US data as well, as long as the data is properly, identified and have been identified during the FDA designation as well. In terms of regulatory, I would say, like, you don't need Canadian specific data as long as you can show that there is, solid data available in the US and they've gone through the FDA. Sometimes in some specific cases, depending on the class of the device and depending on, if they have to be reclassified under the Health Canada, because there are a few exceptions and differences between the two regulatory bodies, and in those cases you might need some additional data to the along with the data that you've already connected. Now, in terms of adoption, so as I said, like, we have a network of healthcare organizations. The whole purpose of building this network is to promote adoption of new technologies, right? And for that, there's two things. First of all, the kind of products that we typically interact with have already gone through that Health Canada approval or the FDA classification. Now they're doing Health Canada and they want to build that adoption case for the hospitals. That's becoming very, very critical, right? And in the US, we see companies going to the other side, right? Canadian companies going to the US market. They need the data for supporting reimbursement as well, right? Getting your device regulated or approved by the FDA or Health Canada doesn't mean you'll be able to sell your device, and doesn't mean that the payers are going to reimburse the the technology. So you definitely need health economics data, adoption driven data, to prove that there is a business case for this particular product to be sold into a hospital system. Hospitals are becoming more and more aware of this as well. Obviously, the innovation landscape has changed over the last few years after COVID, and there is a greater receptivity towards new innovations being introduced into the healthcare system. So we are definitely seeing more and more studies that are happening just on the adoption piece. Even in the US, like companies that we are advising going to the US market, they need to find those sites where they can prove the efficacy of their business case, right? Like, what's the business case you're making, how much money you're saving for the clinicians, for the health system, for whoever your customers are, right? The other side of the spectrum is that there are companies that are, for marketing purposes, they need to have those clinical champions backing the product, right? Because especially if there are, even if hospital administrators are using it or clinicians are using it, they need similar champions in every hospital, right? Because what we see, at least in Canada, is like every health system has their own notion of having, what it means to be a business case. The data varies depending on or the cost effectiveness data varies from one hospital to the other, just because of the population that they're serving or the diversity that they have, and that can impact that decision of, like, procurement decision of that particular hospital. So as much as marketing, or as much as support that the company can have from multiple clinical champions, hospital administrative champions, can help them really scale up their sales.
Yeah, thanks, Vivaswan. I really like that you mentioned, the business case aspect, and it's not just getting the approval to sell, especially in another country like Canada, but getting, the buy-in from the hospital system, from, the clinicians that are going to be championing your product to actually bring it into their practice. So definitely good to start thinking about that. And for our cohort, if you guys are interested in entering the Canadian market, Vivaswan will be at the MedTech conference next week, reminder. So definitely reach out to him in chat to see how to make that possible. Great. So before we move on into, choosing clinical study sites and things like that, I get a lot of companies, ask, what level of data do they need before advancing to a clinical trial stage? Do they have to have, done all of the tests, ISO 10993-1 for biological evaluation? Do they need to have really robust animal data? Does this depend on the risk level of the device and type of device? So Jason, would love to hear your thoughts on this. What should you have ready before you're going to put it in a human?
Yeah, I think ultimately it will come down to the risk profile. So I can explain a little bit about what we've been through before. So we were quite keen to avoid the need for an IDE so that we could move through pretty quickly. So we spoke to ethics boards about putting in place a non-significant risk determination, or an NSR. When that's in place, it actually allows you to jump into the trials much more easily. And in our case, because we had those old predicates, but we weren't allowed to use the clinical data, then the trial was designed around showing efficacy. So it almost allowed us to jump into a pivotal clinical trial just because we were able to get a sign off from an ethics board to say this is non-significant risk. And that depends, or that across all your devices, that is the same. So we will have a class 3 device actually for treatment resistant depression. And that's going to be a PMA, but actually the ethics board agreed with our write-up or our logic that this was also a non-significant risk device because we were able to show the safety from our already 2 cleared devices, those trials. So it really depends on the sort of class, the risk, whether it's an IDE or you can get an NSR. And I would say I'm specifically speaking about devices that are outside the body. So, like IVDs or something, or any internal implanted device is obviously going to be a different risk profile. So both the ethics committees and the FDA regulators will have different criteria for that type of device.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear a bit more on actually this process for getting a non-significant risk or NSR designation. Who does this typically involve, and what stage do you do this in, Jason?
Yeah, I think I'll highlight a mistake people make, I think, and that is going to the FDA and asking if you need an IDE, because potentially you're almost volunteering the fact that you think this is at least needs an assessment because of the risk profile. So we do not do that, and it's worked out quite well. So what we would do is actually go to the ethics board directly, and then we use a central IRB. We typically use Sterling, and essentially then we just make a very strong case as to why this should be an NSR. If they say it is, great, you could start the trial, and if they say it's not, well then at that point you can submit an IDE to the FDA. So I suppose you can almost weigh up a little bit, because you might say, well, that's a waste of time going to the ethics board if we know it's going to be an IDE. I would actually say you don't necessarily know. We had a really similar device. A competitor of ours is a class 3 device for treatment resistant depression, and they had to do an IDE, but we didn't have to do an IDE because we made a case and backed it up with all our safety. So yeah, basically I'll summarize all of that. If you're thinking of doing a trial, you need to either be in one of those 2 categories, and I would start with applying for non-significant risk through an ethics board and seeing what they say.
Really, really good advice. I hope those in our cohort listening that have lower risk devices consider that. Yeah, go to this ethics board first. You might not need that. So, and I've actually seen that with 510K devices as well. Sometimes that are implantable but like lower risk profile. So a lot of devices in the ear and things like that. So I'm definitely could avoid that IDE if it speeds things up for you guys. Awesome. So want to move into some questions around how do you choose a clinical trial site and who you're working with. So Sandra, you're in Hackensack Meridian Health. And I'm sure you work with startups all the time. So how should a startup, figure out who to talk to, or actually to approach in the system for initiating a trial?
Yeah, I think there are two clear avenues that you should consider. One is folks like myself, the innovation officer is always a great place to start because they can help gauge the right direction. But I think the research administration is really where you want to start, because they're going to know exactly where there are interested PIs to work on the project with you in that research, the clinical trial. So I think starting with them is going to be a really critical point, because they're going to help you understand kind of how it works within the organization, whatever organization. For us, I think, one of the things that is an advantage is that we have multiple clinical sites. We have 18 hospitals, multiple ambulatory care sites. So it's really something you should consider as you're looking at potential clinical sites, to identify larger organizations or organizations that have multiple types of touch points with clinicians and patients, because you never know when there may be a unique use case that you really want to do a clinical trial in. And at least large health delivery systems that are integrated have the ability to fine tune and really define the right PIs to participate and the right patient populations, obviously.
Yeah, it's a huge benefit to working with a health system with all these different, yeah, you mentioned touch points and also patient populations as well that you have access to. Beavis, what are your thoughts on this? Like how do you decide where to run your study and should, you do a single site versus multi-site? How do you make that decision?
I think it depends on the product first, right? So if the product needs a multi-site data, right? That's the first thing, right? Like what kind of product do you have? The second thing I think is which sites would actually get, I think, to Sandra's point, I think you need to have every startup needs to have a great, clarity over what kind of patient population they're going after, right? And what's the profile of these hospitals that you are trying to work with as a clinical trial site? Do they serve that particular population? Whether you're going to get the volumes that you require, right? We have seen some trials be unsuccessful because they decided on going with a site where they had a clinical champion, but unfortunately didn't have the patient volumes, right? You need the patient volumes to get consent because not everyone will sign up for a clinical trial, right? So you need to get the patient consents. You need this different things that you need to take care of before you actually can go into that particular clinical trial, right? So patient population is very important. Another thing that startups do often need to think about is funding, right? What kind of funding do you have, and how can you maximize your resources to get the data that you need, right? The other thing that I advise startups a lot is start thinking about adoption when you're designing that clinical trial, right? Obviously, your first priority is at this stage when you're thinking about doing a clinical trial for FDA designation or a Health Canada designation, you're thinking primarily about the clinical data. But can you add a few data points that would show what are you reducing, even if you don't have the data on the salary of the nurses that are being paid at the hospital or salvation that like number of hours saved? Can you calculate how many trips you are saving every time that one product is being used, right? These kind of data, just thinking a little bit outside of just your clinical parameters, are going to be, very useful for the startup from an early stage standpoint.
Yeah, love the emphasis on maximizing your resources, and hopefully at the end you guys have some good advice for how to do so and how to fund these trials in an efficient manner, especially when your resources are so constrained. Thinking, about resources in different hospitals that you could choose to go to. Jason, you're operating a very, international company, in Belfast and also running a lot of studies in the US and California. I'm curious, can data from clinical trials conducted outside the US be used for FDA submissions? Is there any reason why you might want to repeat a study or add one on?
The short answer is yes, you can use the data, but there are definitely some challenges with that. I suppose logistically, even there are challenges. So does the site operate to a standard, or do you have to bring them up or audit them or get regulatory consultants to go and visit them? And yeah, we've done sort of all of this. So we use UK sites quite often. We use sites in India and sites in Hong Kong. But all of those sites, we would have had remote monitoring visits and audits put in place, and we would make sure that they actually, I can't remember the standard, the ISO standard, but they adhere to that. So that's your first challenge, just getting data that is eligible in that sort of logistical category. But then the next challenge is how do you convince the FDA that data represents the American population? And if it is something like, for example, our two approved or clear devices, sorry, the insomnia device and the anxiety device, those we had no patients in the US, but we still got our 510K. And the reason for that is, insomnia is very, very similar right across the world. So it's not like it's an obscure disease in some parts, and we've tested this little population. We tested a really wide population across the UK and Ireland, and a fairly wide population demographic in Hong Kong. And because we were able to show through previous literature that the rates of insomnia are comparable, the type of insomnia is comparable, then you can make a really strong case to say this will apply, or this effect is what we expect in a US population. And certainly that worked for us for those two. But conversely, we also have a diabetes trial which has finished. And we had one site in Ireland, and we had 16 sites in the US. And that's because the FDA said to us, directly said to us, they see metabolic diseases in the US as being quite specific to the US. So yes, across the world there are metabolic issues, but they just want to see data mostly from the US, and that makes sense, and that's why we put 16 or 15 sites in the US, and then our 16th site was in Ireland, in Dublin. But the reason we were confident with that is, first of all, the vast majority of patients are going to be in the US because of all those sites. But then that is kind of a comparable demographic again. So, I don't think the FDA are going to say, look, those 20 or 30 people that you have out of your 250, we're going to discard that because, Ireland is so separate from the US. So we've made a case for all of that to be collated. So in short, it depends on what I suppose the pathway to approval. Some are going to be more tricky than others, but our approach is if you can save money by at least some sites, if not all sites outside the US, then go for that, and that'll certainly work if you structure it correctly.
I think in addition to that, the ability to, particularly in the US, the ability to demonstrate that you've got the right patient population to cover that is truly representative is going to be critical. So it's one of those things as you start to work with different organizations or reaching out to ask them how much data do they have to demonstrate their ability to cross over multiple types of patient populations. It's an important component of any organization. They should be able to tell you that answer.
It's a really good point, Sandra. I hope people bring that up, and when they're talking to these healthcare systems and dig into that, how much data they have on this. Jason, I want to go back quickly to, you mentioned remote monitoring. What does this look like in this day and age to monitor a clinical trial that isn't in your backyard?
Yeah, I think you have to find good regulatory consultants who you trust and are confident that they're keeping everything to the standard that is required. So we use a company in the UK actually, but their focus is probably more FDA. So we're getting them at UK prices, but we're getting the expertise of somebody who knows how to operate trials to the FDA standard. And then a few things that we looked at was, really building a clinical, the CRF or the electronic CRF, and making sure that that's compliant. We ended up actually just building our own system through REDCap. A lot of people say REDCap, isn't compliant. That is not true actually. You can make REDCap compliant no problem, so you don't have to spend lots and lots of money on a private system. So that at least lets you know that the sites are adhering to the data entry side of things, even though they may be on the other side of the world. And then the other thing which is quite interesting, which we had for four of our trials, was remote enrollment as well as remote monitoring. So for our PTSD trial, we're going to have around 200 patients. I think we have about 160 finished already. That was all run out of one site, UCSD in San Diego. But we got ethical approval to do nationwide remote recruitment. So to the earlier point, we have a sample across the entire of the US. Almost every state is represented, and that's because we were able to do remote monitoring, but also remote recruitment.
I love that idea. And as our world becomes more interconnected, potentially have more of these remote studies that, where you guys will ship the device and instructions and, monitor them through this, help a lot, especially for, different like orphan diseases and other conditions where it might be hard to find a substantial patient population at any one site. So thank you guys for sharing that. So we talked a lot about how, what startups might want to look for, in a healthcare system, but Sandra, from your perspective, what is the healthcare system looking for from the company that they're working with? What does this company need to have lined up already in order to get rolling with you?
Well, I think kind of this on the soft side, I'll start with you've got to be flexible. You've got to be open to listening to what that health system is looking for, and trying not to put a square peg in a round hole kind of thing. So sometimes you're going to find that organizations are just not the right fit, or you aren't the right fit for them. And so I'll step back and say on the hard side, anything that is, and I kind of go back to the comments on the business case, you've got to be able to understand the business challenges that health systems are facing, because they are looking for solutions to overcome those challenges. And those business challenges can not only be focused in on lower cost of care, but they could actually be creating new opportunities and new revenue streams as well. So one is do your homework and understand what is important to this organization. So for example, as a health system, we're always looking for those things that are going to move the needle, truly move the needle on those publicly reported databases for US News and World Report, Leapfrog for safety, all those publicly communicated standards that every organization is really judged with, if you will. So first and foremost, those are pretty much, kind of the core needs. But I think an understanding that truly for us, it's a partnership. We're looking for solutions to meet patient needs and clinician needs. And so if you're not willing to be a partner in that journey, then for us, it's a hard sell. So I think it's what we're looking for is flexibility, understanding of what our needs are and kind of the challenges, and how what we need is something that we can work with and work with within a workflow, because that's where the issue on flexibility begins to come in. So if you've got an idea of how your technology is going to be used and when it should be used and how it should be ordered, not that kind of thing, understand that it may be extremely different once you actually get into the field. And I think that's where we're looking for flexibility, because organizations are going to want to solve those problems, but they also know that they've got to solve it in a way that is as fluid and as easy to get integrated and adopted by the clinicians, but also all the other supportive services that are helping that clinician make those decisions.
Really good points, and love the emphasis on it being a partnership. A lot of people just think of this as maybe like a business transaction, and it's, it's something that you're going to run, you're going to get the data back, and that's it. But like that you mentioned, how it could benefit the health system as well, and new business opportunities for the hospital. And I think that there's a lot of aspects that startups should consider that they could bring to the table for this partner as well in this, and thinking of what their unique advantages are in the market also. So thank you for bringing all those up, Sandra. Beaviswan, what are, some of these typical deal elements when you're setting up this partnership that you should think about? Are there aspects sometimes around like tech, IP co-ownership, like other development rights, things that you should be considering when setting up these agreements?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's multiple considerations. I think, Nicole, we mentioned a few of them already. Like IP is always the top, right? Because what we typically recommend, and going into any partnership that we facilitate between a health system and a company, we sort of encourage that the IP ownership stays always with the company. They use the hospital as a test bed for accessing the clinical data. The clinical data, that needs to be figured out who owns what of the clinical data. Now, the hospital always owns the clinical data. Do they give them a license for use of the data for a limited time or a period, as long as they can use that clinical data and think, or the reports of that clinical data, right? So those are the things that needs to be. So data and IP are the first considerations, like who owns what. Co-development, I think it depends on the stage the product is at. It's for very early stage products. If they need continuous feedback from the clinician, they need to consider co-development opportunities, and then negotiate with the health systems on what makes sense for the health system to even have the clinician involved, or have the different clinical personnel involved in the study. I always recommend companies to have separate agreements if there's a material transfer happening between the company and the hospital. Like they need to do a MTA on the separate, which should be separate than whether they have, like, let's say, a co-development or an IP sharing agreement in place, right, or data sharing agreement in place, right? So depending on the use case and depending on what they want to achieve from that particular engagement with the hospital, I think there should be multiple different agreements in place, and they can all be nested under one master agreement that talks about the partnership in general. In terms of other considerations, I think you need to think about whether if it's a clinical trial, who's funding it, right? And since we also fund some of these trials, not clinical but business adoption trials, what are the different sort of responsibilities as of that we want as a funder the companies and the hospitals to follow, right? And whether those are okay with the company and the hospital to be followed as well. So I think those considerations needs to be managed in any of those agreements as well. The last thing I would say is thinking about, as Sandra already mentioned, I think what is the data that you are collecting, right? And who has the access to the data? Do you understand the clinical workflow of that health system? If not, then I think the first step is mapping the patient journey or the product journey in the health system and seeing how you can have that impact. And who are the different parties that you will need to interact, right? Is there training involved, right? When and how do you train the staff, right? Or who do you train? Because training is an important aspect, because otherwise there's maybe one clinician who's involved in, who really likes your product, but there might be 3 or 4 other different types of clinical personnel who would be touching that device or your product in different capacities, and they need to be trained, right? And then the other consideration, I think, Jason has already mentioned, is IRB, or ethics, right? At what phase do they come in? Whether it needs IRB review or not. If it does need, and if it's like a really clinical trial and it does need IRB review, or we call in Canada REB, then you need to consider that and adjust your timelines accordingly. And the last consideration, I think, is time, right? And that's something that is of very less focus for the startups, but I think for startups it's very paramount important, because they have limited resources, limited runtime, right? And based on that, they need to create, as I said, maximize the resources. Time is one of the resources that they are always running out of. So emphasizing on partnerships and processes that would give them the fastest access to the data, and help them succeed best way in moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Vibhuswan. Love to hear from you, Sandra, too, on this. Like anything, Vibhuswan, and bring up deal elements that are really important to consider that, a lot of companies don't coming into the transaction.
I think there's so much focus these days on data and data use, and you've got to understand that health systems are extremely cautious with the use of that data and access to data. And so the security parameters as well are going to be a major challenge. So I think it's an important thing to understand coming into health systems. It's a new world in the last 3 to 4 years. So the security parameters are really going to be a huge challenge. It's just data in many respects for a lot of people, but we understand as a health system, There are ethical issues associated with that data, but there are also just core business issues associated with that data. So understand and be sensitive to the fact that you may get some pushback. Just be kind of anticipate that pushback in your time frame and understand what you're going to need to be able to do to meet the expectations of the IT and data security folks.
Thanks, Sandra. Jason, on the other side of the table, how have you guys negotiated these terms with data storage and usage and IP ownership, things like that?
Yeah, this can be really tricky and can turn into a bit of a nightmare. So, quite often groups are tempted, or companies or individuals are tempted to try and run trials within their own institution, be it a university lab or whatever. But we have found that to be extremely difficult when it comes to even the ethics of you being so close to your own study. And somewhat funny story, years ago, whenever we were doing this, right back at the start, before we had any meaningful funding, I had included my name in a protocol for a very low risk academic trial. I wasn't on as the PI or anything, just listed as one of I suppose, the group that is associated with the trial. And we sent it off to ethics, and then ethics actually wrote me a letter saying that I had to resign as CEO and return all my shares. Uh, to which I then said, I'm probably not going to do that. And I rang them up and basically said, this is crazy. Why don't I just just strike my name out of that trial protocol? And they were like, oh yeah, that's fine then. It's all okay. So you can end up in kind of weird scenarios if you try to do that. But then the challenge, if you're out in the sort of hospital system, trying to contract with hospitals or clinical sites or university sites, we would just be really clear up front and say that the IP is owned by our company. It's not even up for a discussion. We've already proven all of this to some degree. We just need this trial carried out as designed in the protocol. If they accept that, great, that's fine. And then your next challenge is, how do we get them compliant and up to the standard, and how do you fund the trial? But that's a whole different story.
That was an interesting example. Thank you for sharing, Jason. I'm glad you were able to overcome that with them and actually get things rolling. So want to transition now to talking about assembling a plan for a clinical trial. And so, Jason, you've clearly done a lot of this. Can you share some tips for going through the process with the IRB, and is this approval always required? I know you guys got the non-significant risk designation, but what role did the IRB play in the trial?
Yeah, we typically, as I said earlier, use like central IRBs, so we will pay them. We got really frustrated with the university IRBs because they were just so slow, and that's because they have so many applications coming in. But it means that even if you wanted to amend the protocol before you start the trial, then it literally takes months and months and months. So, but you may have this kind of runway planned out, but actually you're just spend most of it waiting on IRBs. So I would strongly recommend moving over to a central IRB. And then in terms of actually designing the clinical study, we tend to try and find similar studies that are at the pivotal trial level. So you can go through clinicaltrials.gov and you can get a sense of what's there. And then also we would look very closely at what the FDA have approved and try to find the trials that led to that approval. And then essentially we will start working backwards from that, so that we can then take out all the stuff that we don't need, but we still have a trial that is suitable for both going through ethics, but then when hopefully you get a good result, you can then present that to the FDA, and it's something that they are pretty familiar with because they've approved it previously, or a similar trial previously.
I'm glad you brought up clinicaltrials.gov. There's a lot of information on there that I don't think most people know is just publicly available. So definitely recommend people look into similar devices and the pathways that they took on there. And maybe that's a good starting point for considering, how many patients to enroll, how to think about control groups, things like that. So Bibaswan, do you have any advice for startups on, starting to plan and design a clinical study? Should they work with a CRO for this? Should they they, hire someone in-house to run this that has experience? How would you first go about thinking about, how do you lay the groundwork for this study?
The first thing is what's the financial situation of the startup, right? That's, I think, determines, and Jason's laughing because that determines whether you can afford a CRO or similar organizations, or you need to have that in-house. I think you still need to have someone in-house to understand that clinical trial space, regulatory space. That person alone, I don't think if you haven't built out a team already, that person alone could sort of run the clinical trial. You still need to go to a CRO or similar organizations just to make sure that you have everything in the right place. There's consulting organizations that we have seen where they would work with CROs, and you work with these consultants to sort of design the clinical trials for the devices. So yeah, and then there's organizations that can help you sort of set that up in terms of connecting with different trial sites in different regions as well. Just to organizations who sort of bring all the hospitals and the universities together. So yeah, it completely depends on your financial situation on which way you have to go. But ideally, if you are planning a large scale clinical trial, it's I think it's always recommended to go through someone who knows the space rather than having someone in-house, because that one person might not be able to just manage everything on their own.
Yeah, thanks for this one. Sandra, you've worked with a variety of different companies. Any thoughts on this, CRO versus in-house, differences that you've seen, or is it really just dependent on the stage? And
I think it does depend on the stage a lot. And I think something that Jason said, which I think is extremely powerful, is going to an independent or an outside IRB. Get that is going to save you a lot of time and effort in getting anybody signed up from a site perspective. It is just it's a huge I can't emphasize it enough. It's a great way to go, and it makes it a lot easier for organizations to really jump on board. And then I think you're absolutely right. Getting a CRO engaged at the right time makes the most sense. You just need that. It's just such a core infrastructure element that's going to save you down the road so much time, effort, and pain, quite honestly, and anxiety. It's just the right approach. But I can't emphasize enough, get an outside IRB. Don't rely on the university IRBs as your sole component, because not only are they slow, they're also picky. And I think external is well received.
That's good. And if it can save money and time and be more efficient, definitely think people should look into that. And so speaking of funding these trials, I want to close this with some thoughts, around, opportunities. But first, clinical trials we know are very expensive, often the most expensive part. So why? Like, what are the most expensive parts of the trial? Is it, compensation for the surgeons? Is it, the device itself a lot of times? Is it, data collection and storage? So yeah, Sandra, what have you seen as like some of the most costly things that add up beyond people would normally expect, and what might be, unexpectedly less expensive?
I don't know how to answer the less expensive one question, part of that question, but I do think that probably data collection and follow-up is really the critical thing that people underestimate, the amount of time, effort, and energy that it takes at different sites. And it really adds up. So I think it is a mission critical thing to keep in mind, that you've got to plan accordingly, and really integrating and having conversations with organizations that have done this in the past, and before you put anything together, and begin to understand what their experience has been, and they'll share with you what their thoughts are as well. So Jason can share a lot from where he ended up shortchanging, if you will, himself on some of those study costs. But that is a critical thing. Now, when it comes to funding, it is a totally different ballgame. A lot of it does depend on your kind of the stage of the development, whether you're at in your stage of funding needs. But I think it's once you get through a certain point, then people start to work towards really understanding who the right funding source is to get you that clinical trial funding support.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. Jason, for you guys, what was more expensive or unexpectedly less expensive? Maybe there's something than you
Yeah,
expected. Yeah.
I think we spent a lot of time almost trying to find a very small CRO. And where we actually ended up for some of our trials was a group of regulatory consultants who also, if wanted, could do monitoring for your trial, could engage with the patients as well as the sites. And we found that was really cost effective, because if you're paying a big CRO I'm sorry, I should add one thing to that, but they depended on us to actually almost guide the trial. So what you could do is get a really big CRO and just hand everything off to them and ask them, come back with the results, 2 years from now. Or you can use a small CRO, but they will need handheld through it. And we found actually that we got really good value for money whenever we went with the smaller group, but we sat as close as possible to the trial, but not so close that we were breaking any kind of ethical boundaries. And then the other thing just is the kind of, if you want to do stats, for example, if you're hiring a third party stats group, that's expensive, particularly if it's a pivotal trial and you multiple endpoints. So I would not underestimate that. And then, as I sort of said earlier, that remote monitoring is certainly much cheaper than in-patient or in-person monitoring. So we would have been flying people from Scotland to all these sites in the US, and some of them we do. We weren't. They wouldn't accept remote monitoring. So we actually did have to fly them. But for the vast majority of sites, we were able to do it remotely, and that's like a fraction of the cost versus them being there.
Really good advice. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that remote monitoring back. I do think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future. So good to know. That's a good way to save some costs, and also the value of bringing in CROs. Often they can be very efficient because they know exactly what they're doing for this market space. A little plug for one of our partners, Proxima. I actually worked with them on a clinical study plan in my previous role for actually a 510(k) where we needed a human confirmatory study for usability essentially. So they were some of the best money we spent, very efficient, and the protocol was amazing they put together. The FDA was very impressed by it. So really good to get experts working on that, especially when FDA is going to be reviewing it for different purposes. So we talked about all these different costs that go into it. So who is typically paying for a clinical trial? The startup, or is it going to be the patient's insurance, the healthcare system, or hospital? Is it a combination sometimes? And are there ways to get reimbursed for the device or procedure if the device isn't cleared yet? So I don't know, Sandra, you want to take this one first, and then maybe Swan here on you guys.
Yeah, our default is it's always going to be the startup that's paying for that clinical trial, unless we're getting something from an equity perspective, which is a different kind of challenge altogether. It's the best way to go. Now, it's not to say that we won't have access to funds to help that startup, but the reality is the startup is going to be paying for that. The likelihood that you're going to get reimbursement is going to be minimal. Don't even think about it. It's just not even going to be worth the approach, unless you've got something really cool that I haven't seen yet. Because they need those clinical trials to make a determination as to whether or not they're going to cover it at the end of the day. So I think you've got to make the assumption that it's the startup, and so you've got to be able to have the ability to get through the clinical trial as well. So for an organization like us, we're not going to start a trial if it doesn't look like you're going to be around to finish that trial either. So I think that's the other thing you've got to kind of keep in mind as you're going forward.
That's good to know that you guys look at, the runway of the company too, making sure it's going to be stable for continued follow-ups. Viva Swan, thoughts on this? And also, are there resources that startups can look to help with this and funding costs around trials?
Sure. I'll give you, so there's a couple of different options, right? So majority of the case, the startup pays. And I don't know Jason's experience, but majority of the case, startups pay for their clinical trials. Now, there's two ways startups can recoup the cost. Obviously, once you are in that stage for clinical trials, they can put it under the use of funds for the funds that they're raising in the investors. If the investors really like the product and the company, they would fund it because they believe that the clinical trial is going to be necessary. Now, you obviously have to identify the right investors. One successful model which I've seen is pharma partnership or a big medical device partnership, right? That has definitely helped a lot of the companies that we have seen in terms of getting their products into the market faster, in terms of funding that clinical trial, getting the data. Now, there can be multiple scenarios. There can be a sort of a options agreement out for license, and then converting into license. For particular situations, there can be direct license agreements, or just if there are companies like large medtech and pharma companies who are interested in just providing that funding for the companies through their CSR activities and to the research funds and stuff like that, right? So that's a very viable option. The third is non-dilutive funding from the government, right? And we, being one of the funders in Canada, again, we are supporting Canadian companies only, specifically in companies in Ontario, and supporting Canadian hospital systems. There are bodies like us across North America who are government funded and providing that opportunity for the startups to access some funding, non-dilutive, to do clinical trials or do clinical studies adoption. Ours is very focused on adoption, so we are looking beyond just clinical studies. We're looking into the healthcare adoption piece, but there are similar sort of programs across Canada. In the US, SBIR has a lot of funding programs that can support the companies. NIH has a lot of funding for startup businesses. I don't know whether a lot is the right word, but they have some funding at least that companies can access and apply. And all of these are competitive. Like for example, for our program, we receive around, over the last couple of years, we have received over 200 plus applications. We have funded only 45, 50 companies, right? So that's how, and it starts getting more competitive as the program expands, as the criteria sort of expands, etc., right? So I think those are the typical avenues that I've seen in terms of funding startups for clinical trials.
Yeah, that's great. You guys offer those resources, and definitely love that you plugged the SBIR program. I think at least half of our cohort has at least a phase one SBIR grant, and often those phase twos are more than $1 million level to cover costs of a trial. And that's often, the milestones that they structure it around. And glad that you also brought up partnerships as an avenue too. I think a lot of people don't think about this enough, especially if there's an accessory device that goes along with your procedure that you could use. So for example, we were working on ear devices. So like endoscope manufacturers were clear potential partners, say like, hey, we'll run our study with your endoscope and, report the results from this, can help incentivize them to put in toward that trial as well. Jason, would love to hear your feedback on this too as a startup. Any resources that you think of for funding clinical trials?
Yeah, we try to get as much grant funding as possible, and it's different regions obviously have different programs. Being in Belfast, there's almost local government have some funds for R&D, so we made sure that we sort of maximize that. And then additionally, UK tax, you can claim back R&D tax credits. So as long as everyone's carried out in the proper way and then filed properly, actually you can get quite a lot of money back, which means obviously you can kind of go again. So those would be the non kind of dilutive side of it. But then after that, really the only thing that we would have went for was equity funding. So essentially we would have taken some money from a VC with a specific purpose to get us to a certain milestone, say it's maybe our first approval. And then once we reach that milestone, then we sort of fund again. So you're into this kind of like almost sequential funding, but every time you do it, you're kind of hopefully going to hit some milestone and add a lot of value to the company.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, super helpful. Hope you guys look into it. Seems like every country has different resources wherever you're based. So definitely find some good advisors for your country. With that, I think we'll close off the live portion of the event. So thank you to everyone who joined us on LinkedIn. Huge thank you to Jason, Vivaswan, and Sandra for all of their insight during this portion. And for our cohorts still around, we want to hear your questions. So please start to put those in the Q&A box. But thank you to everyone who listened. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your year, really, as this is our last MTI Live. Hope to see you all next year on our series coming up in 2024.